Welcome to chapter 4. The previous chapter ended with Lockwood escaping, I guess you can say, his events of spending the night at Wuthering Heights, and the chapter opens here of what vain weathercocks we are. I, who had determined to hold myself independent of all social intercourse, and thanked my stars that, at length, I had lighted on a spot where it was next to impracticable. I, weak wretch, after maintaining till dusk a struggle of low spirits and solitude, was finally compelled to strike my colors, and under pretense of gaining information concerning the necessities of my establishment, I desired Mrs. Dean, when she brought in supper, to sit down while I ate it, hoping sincerely she would prove a regular gossip and either rouse me to animation or lull me to sleep by her talk. So there's a couple of things we can unpack here. First off, that was 2 sentences. The first one being very short, and the second one being the entire paragraph. That entire thing was 1 sentence, pretty much. So, on one hand, I'm kind of thinking, like, oh, I think this is kind of show us his personality. That through this, the way that she wrote that sentence, it kind of shows us that he kind of probably rambles, that he goes on for long lengths of speech that you almost assume is all 1 sentence. So I kind of like that design if that is what Emily Bronte was intending. But it's also having Lockwood confirm to the readers that he is a social being, that we assume he's coming from like a London society, that the reason why he had come here was because he messed up in an interaction and felt that he needed to move from society, not realizing that he is not meant for that. He is not like an Emerson or, Thoreau kind of character who can go off into the woods and nature. Like, that's not his personality. And I think part of Emily Bronte is kind of saying to the readers, not everyone is built to exist in an environment like the moors where you are so isolated. Someone like Lockwood would not do well here, and that led to him seeking society with the members of Wuthering Heights and then not getting the society that I think he desired, but also is introducing us to the story of Wuthering Heights, kind of setting us up with him desirous of some form of interaction. So he invites Mrs. Dean to sit and talk to him, and he asks about like the necessities of my establishment. Just, I think he was just asking for any kind of talk, assuming that she's a housekeeper, that she'll have some kind of tale maybe of this house, not realizing how lengthy of the tale of Wuthering Heights was going to be. So there's a couple of things that you can interpret here, that either he just seeks some form of communication and entertainment and socialization and stumbled upon this tale, or he is setting it up in that way to make himself seem less nosy, if we're assuming that like he's writing this tale to us that we're reading now. So continuing off my previous thought, if it was initially introduced to us like he stumbled upon this tale, he immediately kind of shoots himself in the foot and reveals his true motivation, where he says that she's not much of a gossip unless it's about herself, which he's not entertained by that prospect pretty much, but thinks to himself like, I'll turn the talk on to my landlord's family, a good subject to start. In that pretty girl widow, I should like to know her history, whether she be a native to the country or is more probable an exotic that is surely indignant, not even going to pronounce this, will not recognize for kin. And so it's showing that he is a gossip, he is nosy, he does want to know this tale. He's just trying to, I think, lessen the severity of himself, make himself look better. Again, similar to him knocking on the window, but yet breaking through the glass in the previous chapter. But also, it's him assuming someone so beautiful and tragic as this child widow could not have come from this neighborhood, this country. She had to come from a different environment tragically. Her tale is tragic, but not tragic in the sense that I think he is assuming that she was brought from society and forced to live in this isolation. And so we're seeing this wonderful false assumption from his part, which is something that I love and push other writers to do. When I beta read or edit for people, I often push them to have false assumptions, because that's what makes, one, your characters feel more human, because we can't read other people's minds and we make false assumptions based off our own lived experiences and beliefs. But it also adds a lot more conflict to your story, and a lot makes it interesting that he's assuming this bit on young Catherine. So Mrs. Dean, or Nellie, makes this comment in regards to Heathcliff. She says, it is strange people should be so greedy when they are alone in the world. And the way that she says it makes it feel like, oh, it's strange that like people just exist like this, not realizing it's like a cause and effect, that those who are alone in the world, and well, like those who are so greedy and have this insatiable hunger often end up alone in the world, causing such tragedy in their lives, as we see with Heathcliff and Kathy. They have this insatiable hunger that's not enough. And it's a hard thing to kind of think about, because if that is Emily Bronte's intention, then you might be thinking, like, is she telling Kathy not to reach farther than she should, to be happy with what she had? But at the same time, like, there's a sadness to it. It's like you wanted her to be smaller than she could have been, that like she was uncomfortable in this life, which is such a beauty to Kathy's character. While she was so flawed and horrible of a person, she wanted more for herself, kind of, you can see. But at the same time, what Emily Bronte could have been saying equally as beautiful. And no, we don't know anything about Emily Bronte. Like, really, the only memoir kind of biography we get is due to the information given by her sister Charlotte, who outlived her. And we definitely know that Charlotte altered information to make her appear more romantic and present a certain image of her and her sisters. So we don't know what she was thinking, but we do know that she had predominantly stayed at home, that she had a brief instant where she did leave home, but then immediately went back and was very content. So that might be her message, that to be content with what you have, those around you, to look at the beauty around you, because that might be enough. And it makes sense also for the era that she's living in. She's in the cusp of the Victorian era. She's the cusp of the boom. She might be seeing how fast life is growing, the kind of people who are greedy for more money, more knowledge, more technology. The industrial revolution is going on. Like, if you look at what was happening and what was invented in the lifestyle of the Victorian era, it is vastly different from the previous generation or century. So she, in a romantic sense, again, the philosophy of romanticism, not like romantic love, is thinking, let's slow it down, let's look at human nature, let's look at nature, like nature itself, and look at those around, things around us, and look at that beauty, because that might be just enough. That you would never find fulfillment or love or contentment if you're constantly greedy and hungry for more, because if you're hungry for more, when is enough? There's a quote later in the book describing Kathy's with Edgar Linton as thorns, and you can surmise that Edgar is the rose and Kathy is the thorns. And I am hoping I am correct about this quote. I was obsessed with it during my 12th grade AP English class, and I have not read it, I think, since then. But I'll find out later if I'm correct. But it's close to that kind of sentiment, is the quote. And the reason why I'm bringing it up here is that as Nellie is describing the relationships to Lockwood, as she describes how her previous master, the person that owned the house before Lockwood had rented it, were Lintons, and that her mistress's daughter is the young Catherine widow that Lockwood has met, and that she had married one cousin and resides still with another cousin on another side, because Heathcliff had married Edgar Linton's sister Isabel. And it's showing, like, for me, my first thought is, oh my, like, I felt sadness, because to me the Lintons are the tragic figures of the story, that they just exude such kindness and love, and yet they're suffocated by the thorns that are Kathy and Heathcliff, and even their offspring are still suffering under it. But I did a quick search of symbolism of things, which I'll probably get into in more depth once I reach that quote. But like, roses obviously represent love and beauty, but roses themselves are like resilient. They have this remarkable adaptability to various environments, thriving in diverse climates with appropriate care. And when we meet the Lintons, you start to see that they feel more like Lockwood society. They don't feel like they belong amongst the moors, but yet with remarkable care they can survive. But they then saw an unremarkable care. They started seeing this hostility from Kathy and Heathcliff, allowing that into their garden. That's what led to their downfalls and unable to thrive. But even their kids, the next generation, they had the potential to survive depending on their level of care. And we see like later Catherine and Hareton will surpass and survive. But the Thorns, a symbolism of it, because again, this is romanticism era writing. There's a lot of symbolism embedded in the nature and imagery being used. And with thorns, it represents hardship, suffering, and the consequence of sin or conflict. And that very beautifully summarizes Cabby and Heathcliff, that despite their passionate love that others often view this couple, when you say this couple, you think of that, this passionate love that surpasses life and death and all this, but people often forget that they are thorns. That yes, they had suffered and had hardships, but their thorns are kind of also coming out of sin and conflict that they then affect others around them, if that makes sense. I'm rambling a little. Often with these literary analysis, there's a moment where like a certain wording snags my attention and I go, okay, why did this snag my attention? And in this case, it's Nellie's explaining to Lockwood when he asks the Wuthering Heights on the house, it said, Earnshaw, are they an old family? And she says, very old, sir. And Hareton is the last of them, as our Miss Caffey is of us. I mean, of the Lintons. And that caught my attention because as we will later learn as she begins to tell the tale, she previously was kind of born and resided and grew up in Wuthering Heights. She was a part of that household. And how, to me, it's like how quickly she changed her alliances to the Lintons and people that I think that she kind of slightly made fun of, if I remember correctly, but also saw that they were a step above, like the Earnshaws, if that also makes sense. I'll probably be able to give more examples and describe it better once we reach that point of the story when we're starting to see these characters in her telling. But it's fascinating that how quickly she changes alliances to follow wherever Kathy kind of goes, but also to this new family, even though her family has at least a couple generations been a part of the Earnshaw family. And I think it like in part it has to do with obviously Heathcliff commanding over, but also like it doesn't seem like she is concerned for Hareton as much nowadays. Like, I think she does a little bit when she tells the story, if I'm remembering correctly, but like, it seems more like she's more concerned about Kathy because Kathy is, or Catherine because Catherine is the last remnants of Kathy. So there's actually something I think we can unpack as the story progresses regarding Nellie's relationship with Kathy. And it's starting to look like Kathy is like ground zero of this atomic bomb destruction that goes on in this story, that she is the focal point. She is the thing that is, she's the black hole that sucks everyone in. Every single person seems to be affected by Kathy, whether it's her brother, Heathcliff, Nellie, the Lintons, they all seem to be affected by Kathy. So there's something there I'm very excited to continue reading and unpacking involving Kathy's influence on all these people. And a lot of the classics you'll notice because they are good writers in often cases, though not always to people's preferences, but in a lot of cases they do a great job of stating the theme in a very subtle way. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, Mary is the one to state the theme in one of the early chapters. And I'm saying that because here it's not quite the main only theme, but it's one of the themes, and it's being stated in dialogue by Lockwood as him and Nellie are talking about Heathcliff, and Lockwood says, he must have some ups and downs in life to make him such a churl. Do you know anything of his history? And it's pointing that, like, again, the nature versus nurture argument of, to him, it must have been nurtured. Something must have happened in his life to make him so abrasive, to make him so, kind of fixated on revenge. Like something must have happened in his history where there are many characters in the story that just assume it is within his nature. And we see immediately with Nellie's answer of, it's a cuckoo, sir. And a cuckoo bird, if I am remembering this information correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, they often leave their egg in a different bird's nest. And when that bird hatches, the mother does not realize, often feeds them, and slowly these cuckoo birds, who are often bigger than these other birds, knocks the other birds out of the nest so they can get all the food. And that is what Nellie is saying Heathcliff is. He came into this nest, he is bigger than the others, and he knocked all the others out of the nest, so he was the last one standing, which kind of pretty much summarizes the events perfectly, but at the same time, it's assuming that was his nature, that he was destined to do that, not thinking of the nurture part of it, of like it was a response of how people treated him because of what they expected of him. So like an endless snake eating its, you know, tail kind of thing, if that makes sense. One of the details I also love that Nellie says here is, I know all about it except where he was born and who were his parents and how he got his money at first. And I like the ambiguity of these particular details because it could have told us a whole lot about this character if we knew these details, but by leaving it vague, it then continues to be able to create this image of Heathcliff being a devil-like figure. Like, he just showed up, don't know where he came from, don't know who his parents are. He could be an imp for all we know, and somehow had money, made money. He made a deal with the devil, maybe, kind of thing. So I like how very subtle that is of creating this image of this character too. But we also have to remember Nellie is extremely biased. You know, he may have had a very obviously normal, kind of semi-normal past. He is very human and is again nurtured to become this cruel, where she is obviously viewing it as nature. He is just a devil spawn, in her opinion. This is just a reminder that Nellie is an extremely biased narrator. Now, you see it very subtly, but you also see it very opaquely based off her descriptions of Heathcliff and Kathy. And based off how she describes each of them, she does not think like the sun shines out of Kathy's ass. Like, she doesn't think she's perfect, but she loves her so much. And you can tell based off her wording that she believes that Heathcliff brought about Kathy's downfall, that Kathy would have been a better person if Heathcliff had never entered it, that Heathcliff is the source of evil, he is devil spawn. And you can tell based on like her descriptions of him. And also like in the beginning of this chapter, Lockwood said that like, Mrs. Dean wasn't giving him much of an answer, wasn't sure he can get her to talk. But the minute that he asked about Heathcliff, oh boy, was she sat ready to talk about him and bring him down and convince Lockwood that he is evil. And Kathy was just poor, tragic figure. But the beauty of this story is that despite Nellie loving Kathy, and as I said previously, I'm so fascinated to see why this particular woman was a black hole that sucked so many people in, that so many people kind of got trapped, like she's a Venus flytrap, that she lured them in. But you can tell also that she can't hide everything. There are instances that still bleed through the story that show that Kathy herself is a slightly toxic character. And so you have to start to wonder, was Kathy worse than what we are being told in the story? Is this presentation of Kathy from Nellie biased to make her look better? But even then, you have to because there's some negative parts that come through, you have to wonder, how much worse was she? So Nellie accepts Lockwood's offer to tell the story of Heathcliff and Kathy, pretty much, of Wuthering Heights and all those events. But then notices oh, let me just get some sewing and I could talk for hours if you like, but you're sick. Let me get some, girl to drive the cold away, all these kind of things. And as he's waiting, he says, first off, the worthy woman bustled off. The very interesting description of her, I think, is because she's now going to be telling me the story, how great. So you're already kind of getting a sense of Lockwood and his personality, that he is a little nosy, that he sees the people of this community as almost characters in a book. He doesn't see them as living, breathing beings, because he is now calling someone like Nellie a worthy woman because she is not going to tell him the story that he wants to know. And you can tell a little bit based on his interactions with these people that I think he does look down on them and he sees them as just characters to entertain him. But getting back to what he says, he said that he felt hot and the rest of me chill. Moreover, I was excited, almost to a pitch of foolishness through my nerves and brain. This caused me to feel not uncomfortable, but rather fearful, as I am still, of serious effects from the incidents of today and yesterday. And I love that he keeps doing this thing where he shows the truth of situations and then like quickly tries to mask it with an assumption like, oh, a point of excitement to almost foolishness, and you can interpret it's his excitement to hear this tale, and you would judge him for being this nosy, but he quickly masks it around him being like, I'm sick and I'm afraid of this incident in the moors. This dangerous wild nature will get, cause long-term effect to me. And again, reiterating the dangers of the moors. This is a very, again, like Nellie, a very biased narrator coming in with a very biased perspective of the moors and this like community, for instance. But I love that Emily Bronte does it very subtly that you kind of don't notice it until you really look at it. But I'm also wondering if it plays into like kind of Victorian sentiments of like the excitement to a point of foolishness, or they can't be that extreme of emotion. Because like I want to do more research myself into this. I'm just basing this off like connecting some dots and like doing some readings. And a lot of the Victorian books that came out during that time, it feels very reserved. The emotions feel so much more reserved compared to the books that came after, the generation after the Victorian and the generation before, especially the generation before, which looked into and kind of held up the ideas of sensibility, so a heighten of emotions. The Gothics and things like that had a heightened emotions, but the books that were coming out Victorian, those that had heightened emotions were often either mad in the case of Jane Eyre, or the villain who had, I read a thriller book where the wife had killed her one husband or her ex-husband because she got a better husband and threw the previous one down the well or something. It was a crazy story, but like it's a thing of like you kind of want to have reserved emotions of Victorian time. So I wonder if this is playing a role also in like Lockwood of like he gets excitable, but he's like, I can't show that I'm excitable because then that would make me appear almost mad to the Victorian public, if that makes sense. I'm also, again, like I said, I don't know for sure. I'm just surmising based off like books I've read between these different generations and like the little bit of knowledge I know of society in each of those. And again, like the Victorians, like for example, their idea of romance was very courtly Arthurian knighthood. And to them, I think they saw them as stoic and like actionable, the actions kind of things. Also, just to cite that last thing I said about like the Victorians' romance, that came from Lucy Worsley's A Very British Romance. It's a documentary, and I'm pretty sure book too. She does a lot of nonfiction books and documentaries about history. She's very entertaining. I highly recommend checking her out. Nellie commences her story by saying that before I came to live here, I was almost always at Wuthering Heights because my mother had nursed Mr. Hindley Earnshaw, who, by the way, is Kathy's older brother, and I got used to playing with the children. I ran errands too and helped to make hay and hung about the farm ready for anything that anybody would set me to. And within this one sentence, there are three puzzle pieces that are left there for us to then discern Nellie's relationship with these other main characters. And first off, we can surmise that Nellie is slightly older than Hindley because wet nurses would have to have their own babies to be able to kind of produce their own milk. So usually wet nurses would be a woman of the community or like within town or the land that the lord or master or whatever owned, and then they would be hired brought in to nurse the lord's children, Hindley hence. So we can surmise that she is slightly older than Hindley, but not that much older. But Hindley is older than Kathy, so Nellie probably saw herself as the elder sister and looking out for the two of them. And she does, you can see the sense of it as she tells her tale, but steadily becomes a little bit more hands off on Hindley because probably gender stuff with like thinking like, well, he's a boy, boys are different, they have different expectations, I can't control him, boys run the world. Whereas Kathy is the same gender as Nellie, and there's a little bit more that she felt that she could probably steer her towards and help her and guide her, and it hurt her probably more to see her making decisions that she doesn't agree upon. But also, like, for instance, when Heathcliff came in and Heathcliff and Kathy were like bonded, joined at the hip, it probably hurt Nellie feeling that she was being pushed out, having had a relationship with Kathy prior to that. And on top of that, like the other line about her playing with the children tells us that what the environment was like here, what the previous owner, Kathy and Henley's father, not only with him bringing Heathcliff too, but like also he was a little, it seemed open minded to be fine with his kids playing with servant kids. It's fine. Like it would be a very relaxed environment. It wasn't so black and white, the class differences, because I think the rural community, he's like, well, who else are they going to play with? It's fine. But Nellie also is pointing out that, like, she understood that her class, she understood she was a servant, she understood that even though she would want the best for the two, Hindley and Kathy, and would like to steer them, she equally recognized that they are technically her betters. For the most part, she recognized that, and that is part of the reason why she hates Heathcliff, is because Heathcliff came in and should have been on the same level as Nellie, if not lower, because of his race, and instead was held at the same level as the master's children, and even saw himself at the same level, didn't have the humility that Nellie expected and wanted from him. So that explains one of the many reasons why Nellie despises Heathcliff and paints him with such a negative light. Nellie then starts to transition into introducing how Heathcliff came about by saying that, like, the master came down one fine harvest day, it was beautiful, which the weather is symbolism, which harvest is fall, is the changing of things, but you're inching towards winter, which winter usually symbolizes the end of a life cycle, death. And to Nellie, the master leaving on a fall day means that they still had things looking so great. You're bringing in a harvest, you're bringing in food, but you're on the cusp of an end of a life cycle. And Heathcliff being the epitome of the end of this life cycle, the epitome of this downfall of Wuthering Heights. But also her then having the master turned to Hindley and saying, like, I'm going for business. What would you like from Liverpool? And it's a Liverpool detail that I actually want to pick at, because even though I would love to go to Liverpool, there's nothing against it. We have to think about the time that this was written, and that Emily Bronte is an English lady. Well, not lady, but she is from England, and Kathy, we can surmise, is the Moors of England. But it makes sense that the master would go to Liverpool because that would be the closest city. However, to someone like Lockwood, it would then be able to allow them in their minds to be like, oh, like they're landed gentry, but they're not like us. They're not of London society. They're not quite like our people, which then allows them to make excuses and like justifications to be like, well, no wonder this situation happened amongst this neighborhood and corner of the world. No wonder this happened to someone that is of my equal technically in standing, because they're so backwater and not quite like us. So that's what I think is like very subtly kind of inferring, in my opinion. Again, nothing against Liverpool, nothing against those countries and Ireland and Scotland and all that, but we just do need to recognize at this point in history there was still tension and the superiority kind of going on. I don't know exactly what the environment looks like right now. Please do not quote me on that. I am American, but I am familiar a little bit with some of this tension during this point in history. The other thing about this interaction, this line that is going on here with the master saying to his son, now my bonny man, I'm going to Liverpool today. What shall I bring you? You may choose what you like, only let it be little, for I shall walk there and back 60 miles each way. That is a long spell. First off, him walking should very subtly inform the readers their standing. Even though they're landed gentry, they're not wealthy. That he would be walking to it. Think like the Bennets, of how they only have one cart that they have to share with the tenant farmers that the Mr. Bennet proceeds over owns, kind of thing. And that's why Jane has to ride horseback to go see the Bingleys. Like, they're landed, but they're not wealthy. And it should tell us a little bit about him. But the point of this is that the framing of him leaving and saying, what can I bring this, but it must be little, is very similar, very reminiscent to Beauty and the Beast, the original telling, in which the story was originally written by a French woman and published in 1740s. I just double checked myself on the date to confirm that probably at this point, having been almost 100 years, we can surmise that the story has found its way over to England I don't know 100%, but I'm guessing that it would make its way over there. And Emily Bronte could have read it and been familiar with this tale. And in the original tale, the father was a merchant. He was going to go off to the city where then he learned he lost all his money, but he asked all his children, what could I bring back? And all the other girls and things are like, I want this dress, I want these shoes, I want these things. But his little girl, his Belle, said, I just want the first branch that touches your shoulder, or like a rose. No, I wanted a rose. Again, you're seeing also similarities to Akatar if you read that, but that is the original telling, and that is what's similar. And with what Hindley and Kathy asked for, already is notifying us of their personalities, because Hindley asked for a fiddle, and Kathy, who was 6 at the time, asked for a whip for her horse, which a whip is not big compared to a fiddle, which they're not huge, but they're also not equally small to put into a pocket and carry easily. But when he returns and they're missing, the children first start digging in his pocket and they're furious that they don't have their gifts, and he brought back this gypsy, quoting them, boy instead. And that kind of tells you a little bit of their entitlement. And from what we can tell, even though we aren't positive Nellie isn't putting a nicer spin on Kathy and Hindley's father, he seems like a very kind, open minded gentleman, but for some reason, it didn't translate into his kids. His kids became very cold and entitled and proud, you could surmise. So, yes, that was about it. I just wanted to talk about this detail about it relating to Beauty and the Beast, but also it's already informing the readers of the personalities of these two characters, despite Nellie trying to put them in a better light, but at least like she's notifying us that they're not perfect. So you can also surmise that there's more here that she's hiding, that they're probably worse. Our first glimpse of Heathcliff, at least in Nellie's tale, when he first emerged, she describes it as, we crowded round and over Miss Cathy's head. I had peeped at a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's, yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. And there's a vagueness to this writing, and that's why I really like it. And this vagueness with Heathcliff leaves enough space for us, I would imagine, different possibilities of his ethnicity. He's definitely not white, I would say, based off how blatantly people ostracize him, and usually color is the most obvious thing to ostracize someone. So there's room, though, to discuss whether Heathcliff might be a Romani gypsy or if he might be from Africa, because we have to remember the book opened in 1801 with Lockwood. However, this tale we can surmise is probably about 1760s, because Kathy died around her 20s, her daughter's about 20, so roughly 40 years ago, or 30. So 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, about roughly there. And that kind of trade was still going on there. And the father went to Liverpool, which was a trading port. So a lot of ships came in and out. So it's very possible he could have been African, though a lot of us kind of side closer to maybe Romani. Either way, I think he's light enough to be passable, is what we can surmise based off how other people interact with him. His color is dark enough to stand out on first impression and to immediately ostracize and deem him lesser, however, light enough that as he gets older, he is passable, that he can pass as a gentleman and be treated with somewhat respect from Lockwood. He doesn't outright scorn at Heathcliff, Lockwood, coming from his fine society. So you can understand that, and also the gibberish, you can surmise it probably is some other language. By the way, this is one of our very few references to Kathy's mother, and we actually don't get a description as far as I remember. Again, it's been years since I last read this book, so I will maybe eat my own words soon if I find more. But from what I remember, we don't know anything really of her mother. We get more of an impression of her father based off Nellie's, but we also have to remember Nellie probably is biased. and not in the way to deceive us, but in the way that she probably remembered the father in a much nicer light and saw him much kinder and is portraying him much kinder. But Mrs. Earnshaw, she describes that when Heathcliff had emerged, that I was frightened and Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out the door. She did fly up, asking how he could fashion to bring that gypsy brat into the house when they had their own bands to feed and fend for. So, based off that, you can surmise that Mrs. Earnshaw is of that society. She's of that people. She's like Nellie, where they automatically are up in arms going, why is this thing here? Why is it in my house? Ostracizing, looking down on Heathcliff based off first impression, not giving him a chance to show his soul, show his potential kindness, assuming the worst, which leads to Heathcliff becoming the worst. Think of Cardan and the Crow Prince. He became what they expected him to be. And also, it's like it's showing like her being the opposite of her husband is portraying that they're showing the two sides of how humanity, I think you could say. But I can't tell you. I'm gonna assume that those are her own words of her saying bands. So you can assume that Mrs. Earnshaw is of this country. She's of the moor. She hasn't left this community probably. And because of that, is probably very much aware of perceptions and what others would think of having something like Heathcliff come into her home and what others might assume. And there is this underlying subtext of, was Heathcliff's, Kathy's father's bastard, like a half brother to Kathy. There is this like theory, this like belief possibility of it. So Mrs. Earnshaw is definitely a fascinating character that we don't know enough of, and we also don't see her influence upon her kids, or actually maybe we do. Maybe we do see some of her influences upon, for example, her son, and why he treats Heathcliff so outlandishly, why he felt justified despite his father welcoming him. And there's so many other things, like she has barely a presence, but yet her presence is felt if you actually look for it, but you don't feel it blatantly, if that makes sense. I'm rambling. This description also is very fascinating because Mr. Mr. Earnshaw tries to describe what he had done in his reasoning, but he was very tired, so it was kind of coming out gibberish. And he said that there was a tale of his seeing it, speaking of Heathcliff, starving and houseless and as good as dumb in the streets of Liverpool, where he picked it up and inquired for its owner. Again, seeing it as, or Heathcliff, I mean, as an object, not an actual living child. Even though he is giving humanity to it, trying to give it a good home and a good start, he still calls him it as a belonging, and also as a belonging because it's looking for its owner, assuming he probably is, if not enslaved, then like property of someone. And that also infers that he probably is coming from a country they feel justified of owning, per se. I not well versed in that kind of dynamics of society during that time period. I could maybe research more about it, but that definitely is in play here with Heathcliff. And again, we have to remember that something about Heathcliff, though, is passable for society to then accept him. So something there's more underlying, and what is being said and what is being unsaid is very important. Again, it is very easy to look over them saying it, but they're saying it. So even Mr. Earnshaw is fascinating in calling Heathcliff an it instead of him, but yet also simultaneously wanting to give him a good home and a good start and a good upbringing. And what I'm trying to get at with that last point, I didn't say, is that Mr. Earnshaw is a very interesting dynamic to him because it's showing that you can be kind but still be extremely prejudiced too. You can still adhere to these biases and false beliefs. And to continue with this strange ambiguity to Mr. Earnshaw's feelings and thoughts and opinions, you see him at the end telling Nellie when she was a child to wash it and give it clean things and let it sleep with the children. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is that you can't quite tell if he is treating Heathcliff as though he is a pet, like he just picked up this random puppy, brought it home and went, let it sleep with the children, or if he is treating Heathcliff as a human being, as a child, as kindness, and treating him like his own, like I have adopted this boy, he will be raised with my children, he will sleep with the children, seeing them as equals, which then that's why there's this ambiguity, this intensity in how others treat Heathcliff, because there's this vagueness of whether he should be treated like a human being or like a pet, as lesser. And you see it even here with Mr. Earnshaw. I also love this description of what the two children do upon finding out that their gifts have been destroyed thanks to their father acquiring this random small boy. And it succinctly tells us their personalities and where they are coming from. Because Harrington, who was a boy of 14, which calling him a boy, he is on the cusp of manhood at that, especially that point in time, he would be thinking himself close to being a man because he should be at school, but I think he would have been if he was in the South. But he then drew out his fiddle, crushed in morsels. In the greatcoat, he blubbered aloud as though he is a child of 3. That is my first thought. It's like, are you a child? Tempering? You're 14, but he's blubbering. And then Kathy, learning that the master had lost her whip and attending to the stranger, showed her humor by grinning and spitting at the stupid little thing, earning for her pains a sound blow from her father to teach her cleaner manners. So Kathy is fast because she smiles but then spits at him. And it's also showing that thanks to their mother's first impression gave them room to then assume that they can treat Heathcliff ill, but their father reprimands Kathy, trying to teach her cleaner manners, and you don't know if it's to teach her to be caring to another human or just to teach her to not spit because she's a young lady or should be a young lady. Again, there's an ambiguity here. So there's this idea that we're seeing here, this inherent pride and this selfishness and this belief that they deserve things that will haunt Harrington, and selfishness being Kathy's fatal flaw throughout her entire life. Even when she accepts Heathcliff as a human, maybe you can assume she might see him as a possession that belongs to her, because there is a selfishness that will follow her to her death and lead possibly to her death. You know how I was just talking about how I'm uncertain about the intention of Mr. Earnshaw? Well, I feel like this excerpt at least clarifies it a little bit more, where Nellie tries to clean it up and put it, by I mean Heathcliff, to the bed with the other 2 kids, but they refuse. She doesn't know what else to do, so she leaves him on the landing, finds his way to Earnshaw's door, and inquiries were made as to how it got there. I was obliged to confess, and in recompense for my cowardice and inhumanity was sent out of the house. And the cowardice and inhumanity is not sugarcoating things. It definitely is showing her in a slightly more negative light, even though probably even in her own head she doesn't see it as a negative light because of her prejudice against Heathcliff. But you can surmise that this is most likely what Mr. Earnshaw had actually said. And it's showing to us that Earnshaw is showing one side of humanity, is showing this kindness, giving others humanity, whereas like Harrington and the mother and such are showing the other end of the spectrum. And like I said previously, though, like there's some vagueness in some of the things where it does have like a very sense of like a pet, but I think it's to get to the point of the story, which is that how you treat others can come back and bite you in the ass, per se. That if they had treated possibly Heathcliff with more kindness, and like he deserved it, like the way that they treated Nellie, even though Nellie is very much aware that she is a servant and is punished sometimes, she's still treated with much more kindness, and that's why she is much more loyal. Whereas Heathcliff was treated with such hostility, and it turned into revenge. And so I think that's one of the story's themes or message that Emily Bronte is trying to get at, is that how we treat others can come back and bite us in the ass. That we should treat others with humanity. That we have this conversation of nature and nurture, and I think she's trying to point out that it's not in someone's nature always to be mean. It might be nurtured that way. However, you still also have people like Harrington and Kathy, where you wonder, were they naturally born to be more selfish and terrible people, or were they nurtured to be proud and not selfish? So again, we're having a nature and nurture conversation being had here too. So after Nellie was banished for her action of cowardice and inhumanity, she returns a couple days later to discover that they had named this random child, or as she calls him, Heathcliff, christening him that a name of a previous son that had died, which that is fascinating that they gave this child the name of a son that they had but had died in for youth. And so they're giving him a name of a son that they would have had, and as if he is replacing that son. However, the name served as both his Christian and surname, as Nellie points out, that he didn't have a last name. He didn't take on the Earnshaw's name, so he was not fully adopted. So you have this, again, greatness, this ambiguity. He is straddling this thing where he is a part of this family. The father wanted him part of the family to be brought up with the children. He was given the name of a son he would have had if he had not died young, but yet does not give him the last name. The last name would have protected him a little bit more, possibly. But let's also break down the name Heathcliff. And I have my laptop. So I did a little research, and Heathcliff, if you looked up like meaning behind Heathcliff, it literally means cliff near a heath, a fitting title for Emily Bronte's character from Wuthering Heights. More broadly, the name signifies his nature as an untamed, dark, and savage individual originating from the wild moors. His journey from a mistreated orphan to a grown man driven by revenge for the past injustices symbolizes the corruption of natural goodness by society and a profound destructive obsession with his lost love, Catherine. So it's almost giving him a fairy-like essence to it, if that makes sense, which would make sense amongst the Moors, that he's like a creature that they had brought in from the Moors. He's wild, untamed, and almost representing that you're having this kind of conversation like, bring a wild animal into your house. Well, it's always going to attack you. Or can you domesticate it? There's one side of the argument could be like that kind of being discussed. Again, I love the vagueness and ambiguity of Emily Bronte's works because it leaves space for us to have these kind of conversations. But it also is, showing that the corruption of natural goodness by society, that it's having this conversation about the goodness of people, which is what philosophers were having discussions about of the time that the story is taking place. So Emily Bronte were grown up hearing this, but also from her father, who was a preacher, hearing about the goodness of man, and she's viewing that not everyone is actually good and how that can affect them. But moving on to breaking down the name, Heath, or other, it's a plant or other known as heather, symbolizes resilience, endurance, and good luck due to its ability to thrive in harsh conditions, which very much is fitting for Heathcliff. Not only is this a plant that would be found amongst the moors, but he is resilient, he has endurance, he goes past all these hardships that is thrown his way, the ill treatment he receives after Mr. Earnshaw has died, and from Hareton and from others, being looked down upon, and yet he has good luck. He finds money to then be able to buy out Earnshaw's debts and buy out the home from him and take over, and is able to thrive in this harsh conditions. And heather can mean protection of wishes, while purple heather symbolizes admiration and solitude, which he does live in solitude, but has this admiration for, obviously, Kathy. To move on, though, cliff. The symbolism of cliff is life's obstacles, critical turning points, and moments of great stress. So Heathcliff, not only himself, have these great life obstacles that he has to face, and his critical turning points, he chooses wrong every time, and that leads to the tragedy of this story. However, he also is a representation of these great obstacles and moments of great stress upon others, that he has entered and caused this kind of upturn, or as Nellie would see that, like, he is the bearer of the downfall of this family for the longest time. He is the source of all these problems, that his name almost encompasses that. Upon Nellie's return, not only is Heathcliff given his name, but also finds that Miss Cathy and him were now very thick, but Hindley hated him, and to say the truth, I did the same, and we plagued and went on with him shamefully. And I love the plagues word of it, because it's showing that for Nellie, she sees him as a plague, almost like a demonic presence that has been invited in this house, that she sees him not as a symbol of showing Mr. Earnshaw's goodness and his kindness, but instead has welcomed rumors and this terrible entity into his home, that he's being taken advantage, his goodness and kindness, instead of, pushing other people to be good and kind. And meanwhile, I want to look at more so Kathy and Heathcliff, because there's a very sudden turnaround. It's only been a couple days, and upon first meeting, she spit in his face. Now, one might say it's out of sense of perseverance, that she senses that maybe if she befriends him, it would appease her father, and that is the better path to take than trying to go against her father's wishes and things like that. Like, she's clever enough to know how to manipulate others and stay under the radar often. However, I think Heathcliff also represents this wild untamedness that she desires greatly. That she is the type of person that does not like and cannot be controlled. She does not want to be in a classroom, as we saw in the opening couple of chapters. She does a very poor job at being a lady, as we will see going forward. She puts on this act of trying to be, but even then, she is suffocating within the confines of this role, of this mask that she is trying to put on. She's not meant for that. She's meant to be wild and untamed. And Heathcliff not only represents what she would desires, but gives her the opportunity to be that. But then society is trying to push her back down. So you're having this conversation of young women wishing to live their life the way that they desire, to be who they desire, but society is smothering them. That is part of the conversation being had around Kathy's character. And to follow up with what I talked about, the symbolism of Heathcliff's name, when you break down Heath or Heather, they withstand hostile environments and they endure. And you see that here, that as Nellie describes Heathcliff as a sullen, patient child, hardened perhaps to ill treatment, he would stand Hindley's blows without winking or shedding a tear, and my pinches moved him only to draw in a breath and open his eyes, as if he had hurt himself by accident and nobody was to blame. So it's showing him fitting within his name with this hostile environment that he is growing up in and still able to endure. He doesn't break. He just grows stronger, but not in the way that they would hope. It's building his revenge already. They're nurturing him towards this, like, revengeance that he desires. One of the reasons why I am currently doing a literary analysis of both Wuthering Heights and Jane Austen, and why this year I've actually been reading like Georgette Hara and wanting to read books that have been published at least 50 plus years ago, is because I've been burned out by books that are being published currently today, even though I'm still reading plenty of books coming out this year. Like, I have plenty of arcs I get through, but it has been feeling like trying to find a needle in a haystack with books that aren't outright holding your hand and telling you things. This book has such beautiful subtext to it. It has such a beautiful job of giving you just the bare minimum for you to then piece together, but enough for you to understand the story, if that makes sense. So, for example, the reason why I'm talking about this is I just read the line where Nellie has returned home. She talks about Heathcliff and how herself and Hareton still both don't like, or Hindley still don't like him, hate him, and they often would pinch him and, give him blows and things like that. And she says that the endurance made old Earnshaw furious when he discovered his son persecuting the poor fatherless child, as he called him. He took to Heathcliff strangely, believing all he said. For that matter, he said precious little, and generally the truth. And immediately I stopped and thought about it. Like, it caught my attention. My attention snagged on it. Generally, he spoke the truth. And I snagged on it because Heathcliff is being portrayed by Nellie, by others, as being devil spawn, as being the devil that has come into their home to destroy their lives. But then we get a detail like this of Nellie admitting that generally he spoke the truth. So he's not committing sins in the sense of being a liar, being a deceiver. Everything he has done has been truthful and blatant and clear. It has been done out of revenge, though, because of how they treated him. So it's this like weird cycle of like, well, you started it, so I'm just completing it kind of thing. So that's what I really like, is that just that simple line of generally he spoke the truth could cause me to pause and think and decipher and go, what does this say about Heathcliff? Heathcliff's character is much more than just the devil coming in to destroy lives. There's layers to this. And if you had a book that was published today trying to do the same thing, they would not do anything like this. They would not be like, generally he spoke the truth. They would portray him probably as devil incarnate coming in to destroy lives. They would, or they'd be like, he generally spoke the truth, but no one believes him. They all thought he spoke lies. Or like, it would be handed to you on a platter. And what I yearn for is books like this that you can just pause and pick at things. Like you understand on first read, like for example, The Hunger Games, you can understand on first read perfectly what the story's trying to tell, but upon rereads, you start to notice the smaller details hidden underneath the subtext of the sentences. And that's what I yearn for in books today. And it's, like I said, rare to find them now. We then learn that old Earnshaw uh, was petting him, and by him she means Heathcliff, up far above Kathy, who was too mischievous and wayward for a favorite. So first off, we learn a little bit about Kathy's personality, that she's wayward and mischievous. And that definitely is a character trait that she will never be able to change. It appears that this is something that she has to kind of fight against. It's like trying to build a wall against the waves coming in. Her mischievousness and waywardness cannot be contained, kind of. And we see that going forward, that the wall is her trying to be a lady. They try to suppress her, intervene that, but her downfall is because she's being suppressed. But the other reason why I'm reading this line is the part about Heathcliff being petted and becoming the favorite. And it's slyly sliding across the table the reasoning why Hindley hates Heathcliff. That Heathcliff came in, and because he's so quiet, and because of his tragic past, and because he's the opposite of Earnshaw's two other kids, quickly usurped them and became the favorite. And Henley obviously would feel threatened that his father loved someone else. And this is someone that has always gotten his way, has always expected to be the only loved and father, son of his father, and to inherit. And all of a sudden, there's a possibility he might lose it to Heathcliff. There's a threat, even if it's not a strong threat, because based on precedents and based off maybe law, he might be able to argue that he should inherit the estate. But he is a little afraid that his father could change the will. It's not stated to us, but you could assume that is his fear. And also, just like the tragedy of your father loving a random kid that he picked off the street that knew his own flesh and blood, what that means. But the thing about Hindley also is what he does with that, because the moment his father dies, he could have kicked Heathcliff out, but he doesn't. He keeps him there and brings him down, reminding him of his place and of Hindley's place, and tortures him, which everyone's ending, all these characters' endings fit within what is common, especially during this time, that if they're evil, they're going to have their comeuppance. It's a little bit more apparent in Jane Austen, but here it's portrayed like a tragedy. But if you actually look at these character traits of each of these characters that have a tragic downfall, they have such negative traits that led to it. They're not heroes by any extent. Nellie being the narrator of this tale is an interesting choice because of the placement of the others on the social ladder. And we have to remember, of all of humanity, all of times, we've always kind of had a social ladder. We always want to find a reason to put ourselves above others, even on small scales. Think of when you were in school, you would find reasons to think yourself better than someone else. You would justify things. And it's the same here, that like, think for example in Jane Eyre's The Governess. The governess is such an ambiguous kind of position in the household, because usually they came from some type of class, like nobility, not quite nobility, but landed gentry sometimes. So they're almost on like same level as the master of the house, but poor, which led to her then becoming a governess. So that makes her higher than the servants, but lower than the masters. So often they wouldn't be eating with the masters, but they wouldn't also be eating with the servants, because they're in that ambiguous in between, and kind of left alone. And the reason why I'm saying this is that that's kind of what Heathcliff is in, that similar position, where he's an outsider. He is you know, an orphan child from obviously a different country. Very obviously, when you look upon him, that he does not look like any of the others, that they can use that to then belittle him. But placed amongst the master's kids, treated like them, but obviously not them. And so like you have people like Hindley, who's like, that's not my blood, he doesn't belong here, pushes him down. But then people like Nellie, who look enough like the master's kids visually, but also recognizes her place in the pecking order, and doesn't like someone like Heathcliff, who should be below her, going above her. And like that's the dynamics going on here. That's why she stands so similar to Hindley with her feelings towards Heathcliff. And even like she tries to justify Hindley's feelings, and you see it here when she says, "So from the very beginning, he bred bad feelings in the house, and at Mrs. Earnshaw's death, what happened in less than 2 years after, the young master had learned to regard his father as an oppressor rather than a friend, and Heathcliff as a usurper of his parents' affection and his privileges, and he grew bitter with brooding over these injuries." And instead of pointing to Hindley to be like, be a better person, be a good Christian like your father, she justifies his feelings. She justifies his uh, ill temper. And you see it kind of in between the text that she blames Heathcliff for pushing Hindley down this path that leads down to his tragedy of becoming a drunk gambler and things like that. But like, never blames the father for bringing Heathcliff in the first place. And Heathcliff didn't, it doesn't seem like he's trying actively to usurp the kids. At least it doesn't appear from the text. Earnshaw, the old Earnshaw, gave it to him freely. Old Earnshaw caused this conflict and didn't, diminish it or like, diffuse the tension. He upped it, and yet old Earnshaw is not blamed for the tragedy to come because at the end of the day, he was being a good Christian and giving a home to a poor child, giving him a good chance at life. And so you have this interesting conversation you could be having here of what it means and what it means to be a good person and how to justify people and what, like, the give and take, the balance. It's gray. You can justify anything if you think about it. Very apparent that she dislikes Heathcliff. I do appreciate her as a narrator, that she does try to find some good in him, that she doesn't paint him purely in black and white, purely as evil, that there are moments that she tries to find some good in him. And I think a part of it is because of old Earnshaw strong handing the others to do so. That might still have an influence on her. But I also have a feeling that Kathy's relationship with Heathcliff kind of has Nellie looking for good, looking to see what about Heathcliff makes Kathy so drawn to him, makes Kathy want him over someone like Linton, who is the epitome of the kind of guy you would want to marry, want to be with. And that's because Kathy herself is this weird force that, like Nellie, we're already seeing, like, is tied to, and I don't think she's fully aware of it. But like at least she's like doesn't praise either one of them, or like she doesn't praise Kathy to being perfect. She admits her faults, and she doesn't only paint Heathcliff negatively. She admits his goodness. For example, here when she says that the children had fell ill with measles, and I had to tend to them and take on me the care of a woman at once. I changed my mind. Heathcliff was dangerously sick, and while he lay at his worst, he would have me constantly by his pillow. I suppose he felt I did a great deal for him, and he had it with I guess I was compelled to do it. However, I will say that he was the quietest child that ever nurse watched over. The difference between him and the others forced me to be less partial. Kathy and her brother harassed me terribly. He was uncomplaining as a lamb, though through hardness, not gentleness, made him give little trouble. So, one, you can point out that, like, him wanting Nellie by his side, thinking that it did him good, not realizing that she was compelled to do it, immediately made me think of something from my psychology degree from years ago, which is the monkey experiment. I believe Maslow's monkey experiment. Again, it's been many years since I last looked at this, but the experiment took baby monkey and put it in a cage with a wire form mother figure monkey that provided food, but then also a wire form mother figure with a soft blanket. And they discovered that the baby monkey would spend the predominant amount of its time with the soft form. And through this experiment, it's showing that all beings crave companionship, comfort. And that's what Nellie is standing in as. She would be considered kind of the eldest sister in this scenario. And what he longs for is like a compassionate figure in his life, and he saw that kind of in Nellie and wanted her by his side. He just wanted someone by his side, not to be alone. That's what he craved. And through this, also at the end of her saying, through hardness, not gentleness, made him give little trouble, it's her admitting that she recognizes that he wasn't this quiet and good of a patient because he had such a quiet, gentle upbringing. It was because of this hardship that he is able to endure such punishments from, pinches and punches from Hindley and herself, that, and he didn't complain. And even this shows that he had such a troubled upbringing that it forced him to be quiet and gentle in this sense. But it makes him harder in the future. So I think like it's a double-edged sword where she recognizes that he had such a horrible upbringing up to this point that it like she feels sorry for him, but simultaneously does not want him in this house that sees him as a harbinger of the downfall of their clan, supposedly. Like this hardness simultaneously affected him and made him cruel later, in part with also what the others do to him. Like the gentleness didn't continue. There's a lot to unpack here, but like I think Nellie is trying to point out that like she recognizes that he had a horrible upbringing before entering Wuthering Heights and it affected him, but his time at Wuthering Heights also affected him. And even if you feel sympathetic for him seeing him as a child in this moment, she also recognizes that he kind of is the downfall of this family, though I think she is blind to the fact that this family themselves are their own downfalls. That is Hindley and Kathy's personalities and faults that led to its downfall. Nellie then continues that say that she kind of was straight a little bit that Hindley lost his last ally, that he was alone in his loathing against Heathcliff, but she wasn't, adoring of him. She equally recognized that Heathcliff didn't repay in gratitude what old Earnshaw had given him or was freely giving him. That old Earnshaw was like overly indulgent and loving of this boy, and she could not understand what the master started to admire so much in the sullen boy, who never to my recollection repaid his indulgence by any sign of gratitude. He was not insolent to his benefactor, he was simply insensible, though knowing perfectly the hold he had on his heart, and conscious he had only to speak and all the house would be obliged to bend to his wishes. And I think that's also what makes both Nellie and Hindley against him. That like Hindley is against him because this usurper's coming in and getting his whims, get whatever. And like even if it was his flesh and blood sibling, if he had a little brother that this was happening, it still would annoy Hindley. It would annoy me if I had a sibling like that. It would annoy all of us if we had a sibling that could do no wrong and get whatever they want, but never gave the parent back an equal love. They're always kind of cold against them, but yet the parent adores them. And that's what Nellie is confused by, that like what is this tie to old Earnshaw? And I think it's like a very subtly kind of putting on the table this like idea of like, is there black magic to it? Like going into the gypsy dyes and like leaning into this and gothic, so you get a little bit like that kind of dark elements to it, but it's not plain because it's not the truth. But Nellie is slyly kind of inferring like, what is his power that Heathcliff had over the old Earnshaw? What did he see in this boy? And we never know what old Earnshaw saw in this boy, why he was so doting on him, impartial to him. Perhaps we can surmise that he saw a child who had a bad upbringing and also a blank slate, that he saw the vanity and the pride and the selfishness of his own kids, and perhaps thought their past gone of doing any good, and wanted to amend his own ways, being a good Christian man, but also have a fresh slate of offering kindness and doting to this child, not realizing that he simultaneously is rearing him to be equally selfish and evil kind of thing. So like I think it's a slight commentary on parenting too, that like parenting's hard. There's no perfect way. There's no one way to ensure that you're gonna have perfect kids growing into perfect adults. Like it's a thing like that. You could possibly surmise from this. There's a lot that you could kind of uncover, but I think this is such an interesting dynamic that Nellie's like, I don't know why. And like so that's why she's like, I didn't hate Heathcliff anymore, but I'm still weary of Heathcliff. There's something there that she didn't trust. So Nellie regales this instance with Hindley and Heathcliff and their boys, that the old Earnshaw had bought both of them horses, and Heathcliff had claimed the handsomest one, but when it fell lame, he told Hindley, give me your horse. So not only does it show to us that Heathcliff definitely was a favorite, that he also was very much aware that he's like, I want the handsomest one, and was able to get it, and then knows that when it fell lame, that Hindley would have to give him that horse. And it's showing that he is very much aware of the power that he has in this situation. And throughout this book, we're going to see this like power battle kind of going on between Hindley and Heathcliff of who actually has power in the situation, who has control of the other. And of course, Heathcliff would be a little drunk on this because he's never had such power before in his life, but also it's showing this interaction that Heathcliff is very much aware of the sway he has over others, and he's very good at manipulating people, I believe. And it's, I think, done out of survival. It was learned from survival of his upbringing and stuff like that. I think he knows how to act around certain people, like old Earnshaw, like Kathy, like even Isabel Linton, to get what he wants. But then there are a few people like Hindley who he knows will never be swayed, and he flexes his power at him because he knows he won't be swayed. But he also knows how to manipulate others to get more power, kind of thing, or how to harm other people, kind of stuff. So there is a slight evilness to Heathcliff. But again, we have to think that it's so human that, like, it's not. He wasn't born this way. He was nurtured this way. It was because of his upbringing that he had to learn this. And because of his situation, he's obviously afraid of being kicked, turned out, and take the best of the situation. He's a child too. So you're not thinking too far in the future as a kid. So it's a very interesting human thing to look at, like the psychology and like just the human perspective of them as kids and their personalities, and then the power struggle. I need to find some papers, like academic papers, to look into this a little bit more because I'm just fascinated about the dynamics here.